Kway Kway, I'm Jennifer Neptune from the Penobscot Nation, and I am here at the Hudson Museum to give you a tour of some of the clothing items that they have in their collection. So first we're going to look at Sarah here. This is a painting done of her around 1835, and she's wearing a lot of the similar objects that we see here in the collection. So she's got some trade silver on her hat and on her clothing. She's got some wampum beads around her neck and collar, and it looks like some trade beads as well. The silver trade items are really beautiful and detailed and incredibly done. There's a large silver brooch. These were made in the 1700s. A lot of them were made in Canada and Montreal, and then traded or given by the French to Native people. There are some that were made in Bangor. There was a silversmith named Zebulon Smith who worked in Bangor, and he made these armbands here that have some really beautiful etchings in them in the silver, and those would have been worn around your wrists. And those are in different sizes as well. Like those are fairly large, probably for a man, but there are also smaller ones that would fit on a woman's wrist as well. The silver is really neat because of like the detailed cutouts in it, and also the etching. So if we move down to the hat bands that are here, you can see how beautifully etched the designs are in them. This one is really neat where it has silver crosses that are actually dangling and moving. So that would have been really neat when you were wearing the hat and walking. They would be moving and jingling around. This one was made around 1820. And that one also is attributed to Zebulon Smith from Bangor. A really beautiful and elaborate example. The one over here is from Montreal in that Canadian style, and that was made around 1800 as well. These were passed within families and were an important source of wealth and status. There's pictures of Sarah's mother, Molly Molasses, with these big brooches down, and she was a really respected and powerful woman in our tribe. And the silver that she wore, indicated that and showed that to whoever she was approaching. This piece in the front is by a contemporary Penobscot silversmith, Jason Brown. He went out west and learned silversmithing and trained with some native silversmiths from out there and learned to do stonework and really beautiful stuff. And what's really special about him is how he incorporates traditional and contemporary into his work. So some really beautiful contemporary like stonework, but also if you look closer, you can see the woven ash that's behind there. And brown ash is what we use to make our basketry with, and he's actually woven ash and incorporated it into the silver work and put some gold on top of that to make it shiny and special. So here we have some different examples of beads. The purple down on the bottom, those are wampum shells. So those are little beads that are made from the shell of wampum. And it takes a long time to make those, so they were incredibly valuable. They come in white and in purple. And before contact, before we traded for glass beads, a lot of our beads would have been made out of this. They were really valuable and also were woven into sometimes collars, like you can see on Sarah it looks like she has some collars on made out of wampum. You can see the purple and the white, but also into these long belts that were used to record important historical events, treaties. Sometimes they were made for those, agreements between tribes, and there were actually special people who were the wampum keepers and could read those symbols that were on them. And they would have, they would keep the records, and they would be woven into the wampum. There's also some really special beads here. The blue and the white, those are beads that were found in Castine at the habitation site of Jean Vicente d'Abbey, the Baron of Castine, he's called. And he married a Penobscot woman and had children with them. And a lot of people today, Indian Island, Penobscot people can trace their genealogy back to the Baron and his wife. Those beads are from around 1680, and those would have been beads that were traded. It was really kind of liberating for people when trade beads became available, because it saved an incredible amount of time of having to make beads out of shells or stone. These beads here were also glass trade beads, and these were found in Vesey, Maine. There was a trading post that was there, close to the where the falls are that overlook that. These are from about 1776. Yeah, really special and amazing to get to see those. So trade beads really changed the way that we did our designs. So pre-contact, our clothing would have been animal hides, and probably using like different natural like ochres and minerals to make paint. That designs would have been painted on. So the double curves like you see here and some of the linear designs would have been painted onto a hide. But when beads came, they were plentiful, different colors a lot of times, and it just made making those designs and patterns easier. Another decorative skill that people would have used before the trade beads came was porcupine quills and stitching porcupine quills, and you kind of like twist them back and forth and stitch them down, and it's very time consuming to do lines and patterns with those. So the beads cut a lot of time off making clothing and making the designs on there. About the same time that the trade beads were becoming available, wool cloth was also becoming available. And on the older pieces, you see red used a lot, you see black used a lot, and you see dark blue. On some of the treaty agreements that were made, back in the 1700s, you will even see the list, that the British or the French agreed, we all agree to these provisions, and that they would have to provide so many yards of red broadcloth, wool broadcloth, so many yards of black broadcloth, and so many, kilos of glass beads. The early beads are mostly in white, and then like you can see on the moccasins, there's silk ribbon as well. And that was something that was traded for, and something that sometimes came in those treaty annuities as well. Really incredible how they do like our traditional older design patterns, but incorporate all that work of, the silk ribbon to make the colors and the beads to do the double curves. The moccasins are from about 1850, the Penobscot moccasins, and that older design that's more abstract with the curves and the lines. And then behind them you can see, it looks like those may have been cuffs that went around the wrist because they're a set and they match. And those are also on wool with some silk ribbon. And those are from 1775 to about 1800. So really old and beautiful examples of that earlier style. So as time went on, we start to see the patterns, the beadwork patterns kind of shift. And I think it's because the access to different colored beads just inspires people to do floral patterns and just get really creative with the designs. We're standing in front of 3 different chief's collars and the cuffs that go with them. Penobscot men, Maliseet men, Passamaquoddy men, and even Mi'kmaq have a tradition of wearing these collars. They signify status. A lot of times they're used in the ceremony to inaugurate chiefs, and they symbolize the weight of responsibility on their shoulders to the community and to the land and to all our relatives in the river. So that weight goes on their shoulder to represent that. And then the cuffs symbolically also bind them to the community and to their responsibility. These come from 3 different time periods, and it's kind of neat how you can see the transition of the designs. This one is probably the earliest one, which was made sometime in the 1860s, 1870s. And some really beautiful floral patterns on there. This was worn a lot, and we see it actually in old photographs from Indian Island in our community at the time. It was worn by Peter Nicola. It was worn by Walter Branco, are a couple of the people that we actually have photographs wearing this. This is used to come to our community when we would inaugurate a chief. The Hudson Museum would bring it to Indian Island, and it would be there for the ceremony. It's, it has beads that were falling off and stuff, so it couldn't be used in the ceremony, but it was there kind of in spirit. I actually did a reproduction of this that our tribal chief has, and is used and is worn by the chief and will stay with whoever the chief is, so that we'll always have it for that ceremony again. The next one is a little later, probably 1890 to about 1900 is when this one was made. This is in incredible condition. It's very rare that you see one that doesn't have wear and doesn't have the beads falling off. This was purchased by one of the Indian agents at the time. So our communities had a person that was hired by the state who was called the Indian agent, and he was kind of in charge of money and different tribal decisions. Like if you needed to go to a doctor, if you needed something, you would go to the Indian agent, and he could give you the money to do that or not. But he had a trading post in Old Town, and he bought a lot of art. But this ended up staying with his family for almost 100 years. And then it came up and started being auctioned off. So it was auctioned at Sotheby's, and then it disappeared. And then it came up again in Toronto at an auction house. And actually, a beadworker friend of mine from New York alerted me to it and said, "Hey, Jen, do you know about this? And I was like floored, and like, that has to come back. It has to come back somehow. So I called my colleagues at other museums because I was going to, try to bid on it, but we don't have a big, we don't really have a budget for acquisition. So I figured I would be outbid pretty quickly. So I was calling them to alert them because I just wanted it to come back to our territory so it could be accessible. So I called the Maine State Museum and Maine Historical Society, and they actually talked to their presidents and their acquisitions committee, and decided, agreed that we would pool our money so that we would have a greater chance of getting it, and that it would come back to Penobscot Nation and live with us. So that was like incredibly amazing and generous and kind of a miracle. We were all together on the phone the night of the auction with our fingers crossed. And I think we all cried when we actually got it. So really amazing. And it's here at the Hudson Museum while the Penobscot Nation Museum is moving into a new location. And so it's here so people can actually see it because it's so beautiful. And you can see like the teeny tiny beads, and how more colors are becoming available, and how just amazing and beautiful the designs. The next one belonged to Francis Stanislaus, who was a Penobscot. His family lived on the islands that are near where Lincoln, Maine is now, so upriver from where Indian Island is. Our people lived, all the way upriver on the islands, and that was one of the last kind of small communities other than Indian Island before everybody moved downriver to there. So this was this belonged to him, and it was part of his regalia. This is probably more like late 1800s, like 1890-ish. And you can see the style kind of changing and being like raised beadwork, just two colors of beads, the clear and the dark gray color. And this is really similar to some of like the Haudenosaunee beadwork that you see, with the raised style. It's probably inspired by, some of that design, but you can still see, the reflection of the northeastern, Wabanaki flowers and floral work in it as well. So here we have some examples of beadwork from the late 1800s, from about 1870 on to about 1900. And there's some very sweet purses and also a hat. Up on the top, there are some really nice examples of some Maliseet purses with the floral beadwork. These were made for trade and sale, and also made to keep and use within our communities as well. The cap at the top is pretty neat. Maliseet people have some really amazing examples of like hats and different types of beadwork that they did on different things. So like when they were making things for trade, there were like smoking hats and tea cozies and all kinds of really cool things, watch pockets. And then, down here we have some other examples of northeastern beadwork. Just really beautiful with the tiny beads again and the floral designs and patterns. A lot of times you'll see the floral work and Sometimes you can recognize like the plant that it may have possibly been, and sometimes it's really hard. It may be more symbolic, or it may be a plant that's special to the beadworker, that they would know what it is, but that, you know, we might not be able to tell. This pattern here is called the Tree of Life design, and you see that in Maliseet work a lot. So here we have some powder horns, which would have been part of Penobscot and Wabanaki men's outfits and things that they would use. These are made out of cow horns, and so these would be an after contact thing, and they were used to hold gunpowder for muskets at the time, and they're waterproof and an important part. They're oftentimes like etched with designs and patterns. So we have some that have double curve designs, and then we have some that are more realistic with animals. I can see on this one a moose and a deer. So this looks like, you know, animals that someone would have hunted or that would have been important to them. Sometimes they have ships, sometimes they have flowers. Sometimes it's, you know, the things that are important to the person who owned it. And so they may have recorded things that they saw, or they may have recorded things that, you know, sometimes with the animals that, you know, they want good luck in hunting. Sometimes they're really realistic and sometimes abstract. So they're really fun to look at and to be able to, you know, turn it and look all around and see all the things on them. Sometimes you see these later after, you know, the gunpowder isn't used so much for the guns. Sometimes they're repurposed as dance rattles, and they would have stone or birdshot sometimes inside of them to make the sound. So here we have a really rare example of a Penobscot basswood bag. These were used for hunting bags, and they're really flexible and have some give. They're almost elastic, so if you were stuffing small game, rabbits, birds and stuff in there, you could, you know, it would flex for you. It's made from the inner bark of a basswood tree that is stripped down, and then sometimes it's boiled with hardwood ashes to make that inner bark flexible. It can feel almost like fabric when you work with it. And then that's braided before being woven into this bag. This is a style that was probably made for thousands upon thousands of years. Up until about the 1920s is about the time that people stopped making these. Very labor intensive and time intensive to do, and so it wasn't something that was practical for like tourist trade or selling to people, because they really didn't value, you know, the time that goes into it. This one came from the Stanislaus family up around Lincoln, Maine, and there's actually photographs of that an anthropologist, Frank Speck, took, where you can see people, you know, wearing this and using it, which is really neat. There's only 2 in existence that we know of, and this is one of them. And this was rescued from an auction by Penobscot Nation, Bangor Historical Society, and Maine Indian Basketmakers Alliance, who pooled our resources to make sure that this could stay as an example for people, you know, our community into the future to be able to see. The other one is at the Smithsonian in their storage, and so people don't really get to see that one often, and that one is a lot smaller too. So this is like the one that you would actually, you know, use hunting. It has an amazing woven strap on it, and it can be worn like across your shoulders. Really amazing and rare. Beside it, we have a tump line, and it's woven really similar to the bag, same materials, basswood. And these were really important for a lot of different reasons. So the wide part of it can either go across your head or across your chest, and it's used for pulling things. Basswood, the inner bark of basswood is incredibly strong and really, really flexible. And so you're able to pull a lot of weight with it. Like hundreds of pounds you could pull with it. So those are used either on baskets, like, pack baskets, to carry them. They're also used to pull toboggans. So in the winter, when you're using the snowshoes and you're pulling all your gear behind you on a toboggan sled, those are attached to the sled and then usually put around your chest to pull. Yeah, it just helps you distribute the weight better. Sometimes there's even smaller ones that they put on canoes, so when you're portaging a canoe, it kind of goes across your head, and then you have the weight of the canoe across your shoulders, and it takes some of that weight and kind of redistributes it in a way that makes it easier to carry. So those are really important too, and aren't made all that often because, again, it's a lot of time and a lot of work to go and collect the basswood and work with it. So one of the unique things about this bag as well is because we had an anthropologist, Frank Speck, who was coming and doing research on the Penobscots, we actually know who the weaver of this bag was, which is incredibly unusual that a name is recorded with something like this. Her name was Alice Solomon Swasson, and she was living up near Lincoln on the islands across from there. And she was photographed by Frank Speck weaving the bag. So here we have some examples of birch bark containers. Birch bark is incredibly important and versatile material that we use and continue to use to make things such as containers, birch bark canoes. Some of these containers can even be made watertight and used to cook in. They were important for storage containers. The ones that have the lids on them were used for storage. One of the unique properties of birch bark is that it can be etched. So it's easy to take a sharp tool and etch in a design. And there's some really interesting examples here of that. And again, you can see how the designs on the earlier pieces are more the double curve designs and the linear designs. And then as time goes on and you start getting into the 1800s and early 1900s, then you start to see some more realistic design patterns like actual trees or animals. The picnic basket has stars and trees and a turtle. And then some of the containers have like people and moose, and some of the people that were doing the designs on them and etching the designs are actually like telling stories on the containers and on the things that they're etching, which is really interesting, like to look at some of the old pieces and recognize a story, or to recognize, something that's being recorded for memory. Really interesting and unique art form that's still being practiced today. This tradition continues today. There are still people who make birch bark containers and do the etchings on them. There are still canoe makers, birch bark canoe makers in our communities, and those continue to be made. So a really important tradition to us. In this corner we have some contemporary pieces. There's a silver brooch that was made in the early 2000s, a reproduction. In the center we have an example of quill work on hide. So that's an example of that older style before trade beads start coming in and we transition to the beadwork. So a really cool example of that, and you can see like the double curves and some of the designs in that as well. And then there's a peaked cap. So this would have been a woman's hat, and this was made by me in 2001 for an exhibit. These hats are kind of indicative of Northeastern style clothing. The hats like really tell you like where the person is from. So if you saw a woman from a distance in the 1700s, 1800s or earlier, you could tell from her hat where she was probably from. So Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Maliseet hats came down and had like a very gentle curve that went around the face and then back. And then as you go north, the style changes. So Micmac hats come down and then have a sharp, kind of more of a blunt look to them. And as you go further north, they get even longer. So if you got up to, you know, Cree and Escapi country, then they come down below the shoulder. But usually really heavily beaded, and the earlier ones from the 1700s, early 1800s have a lot of silk ribbon work in it, very detailed and fine with points and curves on it. They're really beautiful, especially the older pieces are just amazing examples of the designs and the creativity, and they would have been, you know, worked on probably over time, probably years even, people adding to it and adding beadwork on it. Sometimes on the older pieces that you see in like collections, sometimes you can see the transition even where it looks like someone worked on it and then someone else took over, or they did the ribbon work but hadn't quite got to the beadwork yet. They're really fascinating to look at, and then to know that, you know, that personal connection to an individual who wore that and that was part of their identity even.